Welcome back to Understanding Laudato Si. In this episode, we'll take a look at the first part of Chapter 5, which is organized into 3 headings. Up until this point, in the previous 4 chapters, Pope Francis has been focused on highlighting and identifying some of the major concerns of our world today, what the Second Vatican Council called the signs of the time. At this point, and then in the remaining chapter, in Chapter 6, Pope Francis is now concerned with highlighting some of the ways, the avenues or paths that we may pursue in moving forward in response to these environmental and global crises that we face in our world today. In the first part of Chapter 5, there are 3 sections. And the first of these 3 sections is titled Dialogue on the Environment in the International Community. One of the first things Pope Francis highlights or reiterates is that this is, in fact, the planet Earth, our common home. It's something that we all share together, and therefore it's a concern for everybody, which necessarily means that we're dealing on an international level, that this isn't something for isolated or particular states or communities or individuals to be concerned about in and of themselves, but rather something that necessitates conversation, dialogue across borders, across diverse sort of settings and those barriers and boundaries that typically separate us from one another. There's a call to a radical solidarity to bring us together to work toward better care for the environment and care for those who suffer most in our human family. One of the first things that Pope Francis identifies as a key point is the need universally throughout the world for us to divest ourselves of energies that require the burning of fossil fuels. He says that this is something that we need to work to move against, and there have been some attempts internationally to work in reducing these sorts of carbon emissions in our environment. One of the things that's coming up as this video is being made in the very near future is the Paris summit, where international leaders will come together to try to work out some responses on a global level and an international level in order to respond to these signs of the times, these environmental concerns and crises that our world faces. And Pope Francis points to these world summits, the ones that have happened in the past, and we may recall, for example, the summit in Rio de Janeiro. We may call to mind the Kyoto, Japan summit. And Pope Francis points out 2 things about these gatherings. On the one hand, he says, there really hasn't been a whole lot of advance or success as a result of these gatherings, that politicians and representatives come together and they consult experts and scientists and the like, and despite the dire circumstances that the world faces, very little is done in concrete or pragmatic outcomes, in terms of pragmatic outcomes. Instead, there tends to be sort of a general agreement that everybody can feel comfortable about, but that doesn't demand all that much. And as a result, the problems that persist or have been persistent continue. They persist into the future. On the other hand, Pope Francis also points to a few instances in which gatherings, such as in Basel, Switzerland, resulted in some actual concrete international cooperation on this front, fulfilling, in a sense, the theme of the subsection of dialogue on an international level. And the one example that he raises, that he points to in the encyclical, is that of hazardous waste and how the international community has come together. There is precedent for a working together, a dialogue on issues pertaining to the environment and environmental degradation. But Pope Francis says there's a long distance we have yet to go, and that the only way forward is this dialogue on an international level. He suggests, of course, that we should be concerned, too, about economic proposals. And here, of course, he has in mind something that is rather controversial even in the United States, and certainly so internationally. And this is the cap-and-trade agreements as a possible solution for reducing or limiting carbon emissions through the burning of fossil fuels. And what Pope Francis is very concerned about, and to his credit, is one of the few to really, on an international level with such great attention, bring this issue to surface, is the potential and the very likelihood of inequality on a global level in terms of cap and trade. What he means by this is that the burden of the pollution, the burden of the effects of these kind of treaties and agreements will more than likely fall into the responsibility or the purview of poorer nations, those countries that are already impoverished, those who feel and experience the brunt of environmental pollution and degradation most acutely to begin with. In the meantime, those wealthier nations will be able to buy their way out of these sorts of obligations and commitments to reducing fossil fuel usage and carbon emission by basically dumping this onto the poorer nations that are going to, in that sense, feel a more concentrated effect of the pollution and of these changes in the environment. So Pope Francis says that the system itself, though conversations about it are probably welcome in that we're trying to think of solutions that move us forward, he says profit cannot be first and foremost our number one criterion. And unfortunately, much of the world and the way that our economies are structured prioritize profit, especially in the short term. And the long-term consequences of even well-intentioned legislation and treaties and international dialogue can have very dire consequences for especially the poorest of nations and their citizens, their inhabitants. So this is something that we should keep an eye on, and Pope Francis says that we need to think more broadly. We need to think beyond profit. We need to think beyond our immediate needs, such that we consider those who will likely suffer the consequences of our decisions, even in these well-intentioned efforts. Pope Francis concludes this section by saying that what's really needed are international enforceable agreements, that a bunch of good words written down on paper, signed by representatives of nations and leaders, while a nice gesture doesn't really do much. In fact, there needs to be something that can be enforced internationally on the level of international law. And the reason this hasn't happened, Pope Francis says, in addition to or in parallel with the reason that global poverty hasn't adequately been addressed, is because there isn't the actual will to do so. Pope Francis is very blunt about this and says that we simply don't want to do it, and that international leaders don't want to do it, and they have short-term personal selfish interests, interests that are myopic in terms of particular nations or communities, or maybe perhaps on the international level in terms of particular individuals who have much to gain by maintaining the status quo, or who want to game the system in order to benefit more than they would otherwise. And under these circumstances, Pope Francis says something has to change, and that something is really our will, our fortitude, our willingness to do something. So he calls us and challenges us as an international community to rise to the challenge of putting something in practice that's enforceable and that is reflective of a change in culture and perspective. The second subsection Pope Francis highlights here is dialogue in terms of the national and at the local levels. And this is not exactly in contrast with the previous section, but maybe a further development of it. He says that it's not only essential that we have conversations about how we move forward in concrete ways internationally or on the global scale, but we also must look to our national political environments and governances, as well as our very local experiences of community, and make decisions that are not, again, based on profit or that are driven by consumerist interest or the ever-pervasive kind of motor of capitalism. Rather, he says, what we need to do is focus on those particular local practices, forms of farming and agriculture, raising of animals, the production of energy, all these different aspects that are essential to a well-functioning not only economy but society. He says we need to prioritize and support and protect those on the local level that are most likely to protect and safeguard the ecosystems of a given community. Instead, oftentimes we don't think on the national or on the local level in this way. And when we do, it's only for the short-term selfish interest. Rather, Pope Francis says we need to shift again our lens to think about those practices that need to be protected, that need to be supported, that may need to be subsidized, and those that shouldn't. Pope Francis says that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. And that's because every part of the world is different in terms of its climate, in terms of its region, its biosphere, in terms of the cultures and the traditions of the people in that area. And everything is different in terms of local ordinances and laws. And for that reason, Pope Francis says there needs to be this dialogue on the local level to see the concerns, to interpret the signs of the times, and then respond as one is able and as a community is able given that particular setting and set of circumstances. The other thing Pope Francis says is that the only way this stuff changes, particularly on the local and on the national level, the regional level, is because of political encouragement, that there's got to be political pressure and action that arises out of the dialogue, out of the discussions surrounding environmental degradation and global climate change and how it affects the particular communities at the most immediate level. And so this is really a call for Catholic Christians in particular, but all people of goodwill and all people who inhabit this common home to actually do something and to become politically engaged. Oftentimes you hear, especially in the United States, this rhetoric of a rigid separation between church and state, and that politics and religion shouldn't interact and the like. But the truth is we are called to be integrated people, not compartmentalized, such that our political decisions and actions and our work and the way that we live our life is apart from or distinct from our faith commitments and the way that we practice what it is that we profess to believe. And Pope Francis here says that what we really need to do is actually enact what it is that we believe, put our faith into action. And that includes political engagement and working to raise an awareness on the local level and on the national level of those things that need to change in order to better protect the earth and those who are most poor and vulnerable in our societies. The last of these subsections, Pope Francis titles Dialogue and Transparency in Decision-Making. And it's interesting that he moves from the international or global level to the national and the particular to the process itself of making decisions. And he says, in essence, that the way that decisions are made are often veiled or covered over in a shadow of uncertainty, lack of transparency, opacity that doesn't allow us to see what's really at stake, who sets to benefit, and what the ultimate consequences, both short-term and long-term, of those decisions actually are. Pope Francis says that we are so driven at times by profit and by consumerism, by our immediate needs or desires, that we transact, we make decisions, we establish policies and the like in the shadows, in the darkness, and people don't really know what's going on. We can think, in light of the previous section where Pope Francis calls us to be politically engaged, we can think of the many ways in which big money, we can say, influences political decisions, whether through lobbying or through political donations, and through advertisements and super PACs, at least as it plays out in the United States. One doesn't really know where the money's coming from, what issues are at stake, who stands to benefit, who stands to lose, and what the short and long-term consequences are, both environmentally and in terms of the most poor and vulnerable in society. Pope Francis says that in product development and working on making cars and appliances and electronics and building homes and other sorts of infrastructure and the like, he says that we need to have clear transparency in that decision making, that all parties involved, all the stakeholders, as he puts it, are aware of what's going on and what's actually informing or shaping the decision. I think, for instance, of the case not long ago of the Volkswagen company and how there was quite a scandal that garnered a lot of international attention when it was discovered that they were lying in terms of their manipulating the computer systems in some of their cars, their diesel engines, I believe in particular, to misrepresent the amount of emissions that came out of the vehicle in order to comport the car with the regulations or the statutes of, I guess it was the United States in this case, or a particular state. Now, the problem with this is that Pope Francis says there's a lack of transparency. And in addition to that, in the decision-making, both on the part of Volkswagen, but also perhaps on the part of the political entities in work there, he says that oftentimes regulations are placed after the fact. They're post factum. They're introduced in such a way that to increase the transparency of decision making, what we need to do is front end this. That we have to sit down with one another, all the stakeholders, all those involved, and really outline what's at stake and how it is that we can achieve better care for the earth and one another in society, and set the bar, set the stage, establish the regulations, the rules and laws up front, and then enforce them. Unfortunately, with shifting expectations, shifting rules, and adaptable or alternative rules, depending on who's playing the game or who's paying whom in some cases, there isn't, in a sense, a clear and readily accessible vision or presentation of what's going on. And Pope Francis says that in order for us to make any kind of substantive and legitimate change, there has to be absolute transparency. Everybody has to put their cards on the table, in other words. At the end of this section, Pope Francis adds one little caveat that may come as some comfort to those who at times feel that where is all of this discussion about the economy and about the political life and about science? Where is this coming from? It seems unlike the Church's typical form of teaching. And Pope Francis says, well, on the one hand, and he makes clear that the Church does not presume to answer all the questions related to the scientific and political realm. It's not settling the debates or the concerns that are ongoing and that need to continue. But what he is in a position to do, and what the purpose of this formal church teaching is all about, is encouraging us to engage and not distance ourselves from the decision-making and the discussion and the responsibilities that arise in the wake of something like the global climate change, which is an absolute reality, or the devastating effects of environmental degradation like pollution or extinction and the like. These are things that Pope Francis says we cannot shy away from as church and that pertain to our life of faith. So while the church isn't pretending to settle or prescribe concrete ways that scientists must do this or politicians must pass this law in a very specific way, he does say that all Christians have a responsibility to be engaged in these realms and to contribute to the common good, protecting and promoting the common good, both for all people and for all who share this common home. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the second half of Chapter 5. And as always, I thank you for watching the video. I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and share this video with others. I encourage you to like it and write your comments, your observations, suggestions, and questions in the space below. And as always, may the Lord give you peace.